think we can get started. My name's Clint Gardner, and this is the first of our peer-centered Meet the Authors discussions. Today we have the honor of having Rebecca Day Babcock, whose Tell Me How It Reads we're going to discuss today. But just a couple of things to help us get along with the conversation. If you don't want that little beep sound or water drop sound popping off when anybody types anything, just click on the little tick box next to the sounds, well, the label that says sounds down the bottom there, and that'll stop that from happening. We may have a captioner here today, and basically what hopefully that will do is get the conversation at least on text for anyone who is deaf or hard of hearing, so they can participate in the discussion as well. If you want, you can hook up your camera and your microphone to join in the discussion. That's up to you. If you do that, you probably want to make sure that you put it on the push to talk option so that your mic's not open all the time. That prevents a lot of crosstalk. And one other thing, you might want to say who you are if you are going to go on audio. Otherwise, we can take discussion. If you want to stay on text down below, you can do that as well. Let's see. Yeah, why don't we start with some brief introductions. Like I said, I'm Clint Gardner. I'm the Student Writing Center Director here at Salt Lake Community College. I put together PeerCentered way back in the 90s. It was an online discussion, a text chat discussion only. Then we kind of moved to a blog, and now we're kind of bringing back some of these text chats, and now we're adding on top of this the fun of doing an audio video discussion. But I'm going to have Rebecca, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll have folks in the audience here say where they're from and what's going on with that too. Okay.
Okay, yes, I am Associate Professor of English at the University of Texas Permian Basin, where I teach both writing and linguistics courses. I teach a lot of future teachers, teacher preparation. My interests are in writing centers and disability and in meta-research, and I have a new growing interest in folk linguistics that I hope to get more into in the future. And I'm really a big booster of writing center research, so I hope I can inspire some of you to engage in your own research projects maybe. That's it. Anything else you want to know, just ask me.
You bet. Well, everybody else in the audience, you can say where you're from and what your interests are. Perhaps you can just type that into the text area. At least we can get a sense of who you all are. And like I said, if you want to hook up your audio, your camera, you just click on the Start Broadcasting thing. I didn't say that, but you can hook it up if you want to share that way, or you can stay in the text down below. But I'm going to kick it off because I did have a question just to kind of get the ball rolling. This is an open discussion for everybody, so feel free to pop out questions there, and we'll get to them. If anything scrolls off, I'll make sure to scroll off and get it up, but you can always mention it again. But Rebecca, why did you want to study deaf writers in the Writing Center, and what's your interest in disability and Writing Center studies? What's that all about, or where does that come from?
Well, one of the kind of my research boosting activities is that I think all Writing Center workers can engage in what's called teacher research or action research, or we could even call it tutor research, where things that happen on a daily basis, you take those as topics for research and you reflect on your practice. So what happened with the deaf writers, I was working in a writing center and 2 deaf women writers came in, and I saw the tutors immediately sort of, okay, this is something different, we don't know what to do here. I saw the tutors sometimes even shy away or try to pretend like they were busy so they could avoid tutoring these women, just because they were unfamiliar with the practice of tutoring without conversing in speech. So I guess I can kind of just go right into what happened and how it was. So we would communicate by writing notes on paper, which works very well. just write whatever you would want to talk, whatever you'd want to say. It's very simple. We also would use an interpreter, and the interesting thing in this situation was that the interpreter uh, didn't always follow, let's say, the interpreter's code of ethics, because the interpreter's code of ethics says that the interpreter is not supposed to inject her own material into the interpreting. So what would happen with these two women? The tutoring session would be going on, and the interpreter would be adding sort of stuff that was not just purely facilitating communication between the tutor and the tutee. So I just saw this whole dynamic, and I saw this whole thing happening in front of me, and I was interested to find out what is this all about. And at that time, there had been no research on tutoring writing in a writing center context with deaf people using interpreters. There just had been nothing. The closest study was Roy had a study 2000 called Interpreting as a Discourse Process, where she studied a teacher conference between a hearing teacher and a deaf graduate student that an interpreter was present for. But before that, there really had been nothing with hearing tutors and deaf tutees and interpreters. So when I did my doctoral work, I went to IUP, and I had to pick a dissertation topic, of course, and I was kind of interested in this as a topic, but I wasn't really sure what I was going to do for my dissertation. So one of the professors told me to free write on my different topics, and ever since I did that, I knew I had to research about deaf tutees in the Writing Center, because as I did my free writing, it just came, and interesting ideas, and I was just writing and writing. And ever since that time, when students come to me and say, what should my topic be for my paper or for my thesis or whatever, I often encourage them to free write about their various topics. And when you free write about your topic and it's your right topic, you'll know it, because that free writing will just come and it'll flow. So I know that was a long answer to a short question, but that's how I got interested in it. And I did the research.
No, that's cool. Yeah,
that's the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's cool. I think it's always good to get a sense of where people are coming from, why they're interested in this, and that's my experience with deaf writers as well. We have quite a few who come in to our writing center here at Salt Lake Community College, because we're closely tied with the deaf school. And one of the issues we had were the problems, as you mentioned, with interpreters, and many of the writers really didn't like their interpreters, so that they wouldn't even ask for them anymore, and we ended up just passing notes and that sort of thing. But what is that like with the intermediary of the interpreter, particularly when it's such a close discussion that happens in a writing center setting? What did you find in your study? Were writers who worked with interpreters more comfortable, or did they feel just fine working, just passing notes back and forth? And also in your, I'm trying to recall, in your study itself, did you have any tutors who actually could sign themselves, and so there was an intermediary?
Okay, I have to make some notes here, because there's a lot of answers to that question. First, I guess I want to talk about the language. I think you and I talked about this before, and it's one thing I learned in my study, that the language issue is very complicated, and there's a stereotype. There's two sort of opposite stereotypes that says all deaf people know American Sign Language, and there's another stereotype that says all deaf people know how to speak English or know how to sign English. And neither of these stereotypes is true. In the real reality, deaf people have a range of linguistic abilities and a range of bilingualism in English and ASL. So an interpreter, let's hope that the interpreter is registered with the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which means that they're properly trained and they have passed different exams to be able to interpret and also transliterate. So I'll explain the difference between those. Transliterate means you translate English into sign word for word. Direct translation from English into sign. That's transliterating. So you're speaking English and you're signing English, and it's just like that, word for word. And interpreting is taking English and interpreting into American Sign Language, which is a different language. Some people think English, that the ASL is somehow English with bad grammar, something like that. It's absolutely not true. American Sign Language is its own language. English can also be signed on the hands, which is the English language. American Sign Language can be signed on the hands, and that's American Sign Language. So sometimes issues will come up. Interpreters can either be certified as interpreters or translators or both. I had one tutee in the study. She only wanted her interpreter to transliterate word for word into English, into sign exactly what the tutor was saying, so she could catch the tutor's exact words, interpreting the meaning of what the tutor said into the other language of American Sign Language. So that one tutee said she had an interpreter at one point that insisted on using American Sign Language when the tutee, she did not want the different interpreter. That same young woman told me she preferred to do her math tutoring without an interpreter. So the math tutoring, she found it better to do that right on paper, where she could just watch what the tutor was writing with the math, because it really didn't take that much English to explain the math. It could be all explained right there on paper. So Clint, I don't know what the issues were, but if the interpreter is properly trained, they're going to match the language output of the tutee, or the language kind of desire of the tutee. Another thing that I learned in my study was that the deaf tutees would say they were signing ASL, but in reality they were signing what's called contact sign, which is sort of a mixture between English and ASL. And since I don't know sign language very well, I couldn't tell from watching them signing actually what language they were using. Data to a linguist at Gallaudet, and she viewed these, or VHS, whatever they were, she viewed those with her team, and then she came back to me and said, they're signing contact sign. Because without being a trained linguist in sign language, the average person really can't tell if it's ASL or contact. So, oh, and as for tutors who only use sign language, I didn't get to study that in my study, but anecdotally, one of the research sites used to have tutors that would tutor the student directly in sign language, and it worked out very well because the tutor was skilled in American Sign Language and the tutees preferred to use American Sign Language. There could be some, I guess maybe some tension if the two people preferred to use a different type of sign language in the tutorial. For instance, if the tutor insisted on using English signing and the tutee didn't want that. But since I didn't study it, I can't really say. That would be really a ripe topic for research. And actually, in my recommendations for future research, I recommend that someone who knows sign language very well and knows all aspects of sign language to study that. Because Gail Wood, in her article about tutoring deaf students, said that the tutees didn't learn as well when the tutors used American Sign Language, but there was no data to back that up. So that's a real open topic for someone to research if they were interested. Down here, let me read it.
Okay, go ahead. And Josh Ambrose has a question. I'll read the question. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, I don't want to take over your modifier duties, moderator.
Well, no, I was just going to read the question in case somebody they can't see it on the screen on the archive. Josh Ambrose asks, you don't talk much about technology aids in the book. Do you know of other centers using computer-based chat or other aids more?
Part of the difficulty with this study was finding research sites. It was very difficult, and it took me over a year to just find the research sites because I wanted to be within driving distance from my home. I didn't want to have to take an airplane to get to these sites because I really didn't have the money, the funds to do that. Even though I did get a generous grant from IWCA, it still wasn't going to cover plane fare to fly to all these writing centers. So I was limited to, I limited myself to a 2-hour driving distance from home. So I was limited with what I could do. there was a potential research site that was using technology, but while I was collecting the data, they never had a deaf tutee who qualified for the study and who was willing to participate in the study, because I had several layers to go through permissions. First, I had to have the Writing Center agree to host me in my study, and then I had to wait until an actual deaf person would come to the Writing Center and agree to be part of the study. At that one place where they were using technology, there was a student who was very much interested in participating, but he was hard of hearing, and my committee decided that I should just focus on deaf people because it would have been too much to focus on also on hard of hearing. So there's another great ripe area for research, is to research on hard of hearing students in the Writing Center. So what are they doing with technology? Well, at that one research site that I didn't get to use to study at, instead of writing notes on paper, they would just sit together at the same terminal and just basically write notes back and forth to each other on a Word document. And that was also how Gail Wood, in her article, they did the tutoring. Of course, if you were doing synchronous tutoring and at a distance where people were typing in real time, there would be no difference between being deaf or hearing if you're strictly typing on a chat. So do I know of other centers? I do, but I feel I can't say because of the confidentiality of my research that I cannot tell the name of the university, and I'm sorry. Because it was one of the
I think that's
research, if you can understand that. So.
Yeah, I think that certainly makes sense, based upon the research that you've done. But I'm sure probably, looking into the issue, I think that would be a good discussion point at somewhere to talk about what types of technologies writing centers might be using to work with not just the deaf, but hard of hearing, but also any students with disabilities or writers with disabilities. I'm sure there are various technologies that are out there. But Karen, we have a question from Karen Rowan. How do you think what you learned from your research reshaped your current approach to tutor/teacher education? Great question, Karen.
Wow. Really, I had the opportunity to tutor one deaf person, and we did tutor by writing notes on paper, so we didn't actually get to use interpreters. At the writing, well, it's not a writing center anymore, but where I work is now a success center, and they don't hardly ever have deaf people come in. I don't think in the 7 or 8 years since I've worked there that they've had any deaf people come in. So it's almost like all their practice, it's not really that relevant for them. But I would think it could spread, like Clint said, these techniques could spread to people with other disabilities or people with different learning styles, people with maybe second language writers. A lot of the techniques or the things that I learned apply more than just to deaf people. So maybe you can ask a follow-up question because I don't think I answered that very well.
Well, while
it led me to write that article, Outlaw Tutoring,
Sure, go ahead.
where I say that we shouldn't train tutors on strictly non-directive stances, because when I saw the poor tutor asking her questions about preposition, that she didn't even know, I saw that and said, oh, we can't train tutors to do strictly non-directive tutoring because it's just not fair to someone that they don't, and if you try to get a preposition out of someone, they just don't know the preposition. It's not idiomatic to them. It's not fair.
Actually, Rebecca, that leads me to an interesting part of your text, your book.
And I think that's the most important one. Don't try to draw something out of someone that's not in there. Especially if it's a rule or an expression in English, just tell the person. We don't say tutor because it just causes a lot of grief and frustration to try to draw someone out.
Yeah, I'm interested in going back to what you're talking about, directive, non-directive, and it's, one of my questions initially when I was thinking about this is, you talk early on about how, you know, directiveness or non-directiveness can be a cultural
Your audio
conflict
sort of
for
froze.
the
Maybe you
deaf.
can type what
Do
you
you
were
want to
saying.
explain that a bit? Test, test. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. I I found also in my research that deaf people value directness, and they really value just being told directly. If the tutor knows something and the deaf person needs to know it, it can be considered kind of rude in deaf culture not just to tell the person and to sort of play these language games where the tutor tries to draw the tutee out or make the, kind of guess what the tutor is thinking kind of game. That's not really going to be culturally sensitive. So, but again, I'm really a student. I'm just a student of this. I have to say mostly what I know I've read in books, but I did experience some of it in my interview process because when we were trained at IUP how to interview people, you're never supposed to tell the answer that you want in your interview question. You're supposed to ask these kind of vague, general questions and draw the person out so the person will just, not be led to one or another answer. But I found with at least one of the deaf participants, it was hard to get her to tell me things because I was asking these sort of vague questions. So the interpreter told me, you need to tell her exactly what you want to know. You need to sort of actually give the answer in the question, like, is it this, or is it this, or maybe it's something else, rather than just like, okay, tell me how you feel about your tutoring sessions, or something very vague like that. So even the interview techniques that we're taught are cultural, they're cultural. And when speaking with people from different cultures, our cultural understandings don't always work.
Cool. We've got a question from Sam. For those who are deaf, is English almost a second language since ASL is a separate language? So then would ESL students' strategies be effective?
And Clint, I think there may be some other questions that we didn't get to from before, but I will answer that. I said a little bit in the beginning, we cannot stereotype. There is no stereotype that all deaf people know ASL, or all deaf people know English, or all deaf people are second language speakers of English. There are a lot of stereotypes out there, but as we know about stereotypes, they're sometimes true, but they're not always ever all true. So sure, a lot of deaf people know ASL, but a lot of deaf people don't. Um, a lot of deaf people are monolingual in English and don't know ASL at all. So we can't just assume. Um, Actually, most deaf people who are native ASL speakers, meaning that their parents are deaf, are raised bilingually. Um, from the research that I've done is that most deaf parents raise their deaf children bilingually with ASL and English both, sort of native bilingual. So it'd be very, very, very rare for someone to be monolingual in ASL. Of course, it's possible. Anything's possible. And if I say there is no deaf person who's monolingual in ASL, I'm going to be wrong, because of course there are. But in general, I would say probably you could say that most U.S. deaf people are bilingual to some extent in ASL and English, although there are on both ends of the spectrum people who may be monolingual in one or the other. So in general, we just can't say. It's probably a
Yeah,
terrible
that
answer to
makes
the
sense.
question, but the reality is we can't generalize.
Yeah, certainly that makes sense, and ultimately it's very difficult to generalize with non-native speakers of English, given the wide variety of lingual language backgrounds that those writers have as well. But yes, we did miss one. It was from Therese Thonis, and she says, at the University of Kansas, we've insisted that deaf and HOH writers, hard of hearing writers, attend their session with interpreters, but we found that they prefer to work without interpreters. Are we offering them the best service?
Well, Therese, my conclusion was that the communication should be based on the preference of the tutee. Sometimes, like Clint said, if the tutee is not happy with the job that the interpreter is doing, they may feel uncomfortable saying that in front of the interpreter who's sitting right there, telling the tutor, you know, I don't want to bring my interpreter because she's doing a terrible job, and it's kind of going to be awkward. So I think Tonya Stremlau Johnson talked about this and said perhaps from time to time the tutee should visit with the tutor without the interpreter so they can discuss any issues that are arising due to the job that the interpreter is doing. And so I think your tutee should be encouraged to communicate with the tutor in whatever way is most comfortable for them, and not require that they do it one way or the other because they may feel more or less comfortable. And try doing the computer thing where they type actually on a Word document instead of writing notes.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that in your study you were finding that some of the interpreters were taking liberties, maybe not exactly translating, but adding to it. What did that entail? Were they just adding to what the tutor was saying?
Like what should be in the paper?
Was that basically what they were doing? Is they were taking on the more directive role in a sense, because they felt that the tutor wasn't being directive enough. Is that the idea behind it?
Wow, I never thought of it that way. That's quite interesting. Wow. Well, yeah, it is the interpreter's job to mediate culturally. The interpreter, sorry, who did that was not part of my formal study. It was part of the situation that happened at the writing center I was at before that prompted the study. So we would notice that the interpreter would add stuff that the tutor didn't really say, like, oh, well, why don't you try this, or why don't you do that? The interpreter would add stuff. But you're right, maybe the interpreter was trying to be a cultural mediator rather than just like a busybody. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, that is interesting. And yeah, and that just came upon me when you were in terms of thinking of the terms of that cultural conflict about directiveness and not being straightforward. But in any case, well, with that, you know, do you see any other cultural conflicts with deaf writers with traditional writing center practice? You know, well, I've got one that I can think of right off the bat: reading it aloud.
That I didn't see that so much, but I did see some tutors would read the paper aloud and then the interpreter would transliterate. And in some cases, perhaps the tutee would prefer that, and that's maybe another way to do the paper. There was an instructor, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, who suggested that the tutee should transliterate the paper into sign language just to kind of see how the paper felt on the hands. The original title of my book, here it is, Tell Me How It Reads. The title really was Tell Me How It Sounds, because the tutor would say that to the deaf tutee. They would say, tell me how it sounds. And the Gallaudet University Press thought people wouldn't understand that was ironic, that the title was ironic. So they suggested that I change the title. But yeah, it is ironic when a tutor tells a deaf tutee, well, how does that sound? Well, because they don't know. They can't hear. So the paper could be transliterated to see how the paper feels on the hands. The tutor could read the paper out loud and the interpreter be transliterating. It could be read on the paper. There's a lot of ways that it could be done. And don't forget, some deaf people can hear. I mean, I know that sounds strange, but some deaf people can hear. They can hear enough, if with their hearing aids perhaps, to hear the paper read aloud. So there's that too.
Interesting. And do you see any other cultural conflicts with traditional, so-called traditional writing center practice? with either the deaf or any other disability issues, or working with riders with any other sorts of disabilities.
Well, the one that I there were certain things that I expected to see that I didn't see because I read about in books. I read about like deaf people they like to hug, they like to touch. I didn't see a lot of issues with that in the tutoring sessions because tutors and tutees don't usually really hug each other that much. So I didn't see that. Um, I thought I was going to see a lot of issues related to time, to these tutorials taking more time, but the structure of these writing centers was so regimented where it was a half-hour tutorial or it was an hour tutorial, and you had to get in and get out on time because here comes the next person for their tutoring session. So that time issue wasn't really an issue, except for in one case I observed a tutoring session with a deaf person and a tutor where they wrote notes on paper, and the tutoring session took over an hour and a half, and that was long. I think that's kind of long and tedious for anyone. So the issues that I expected to see, I didn't see that much. But it may be for in writing centers where they have no time limit on the tutoring session and they're trying to write notes back and forth, that it may take a lot of time. It may be draining.
Yeah, just going to encourage the folks out there listening and in the chat room there. You can ask questions. Feel free if you've anything that comes up. Um, I'm just looking over my notes here to see what other questions I was thinking of. We got one from Teresa again. Have you considered creating a quick and dirty guide for the Writing Center tutors on this topic? And actually, I think Teresa, Rebecca does have some suggestions in the last chapter of practical suggestions. Maybe you could talk about that, Rebecca, as well as that, as well as saying how that might fit. This might be, yeah. I mean, we could turn out. That was one of my questions: is what practical advice do you have for writers? And then we've also got KD Blue 91. How effective are the ASL courses in aiding with tutoring with deaf students?
Well, let me try to answer Teresa's first. I do have the article in Linguistics and Education about tutoring a deaf student, and if any of you have, I think it's Science Direct, it's available. I don't know what other databases it's available in, but I'm sure most of you have access to databases through your institutions. If you have access to Linguistics and Education, you can get that article. It is kind of lengthy, but it covers things. There's also a shorter article that I have in the book Disability and the Teaching of Writing, which just details one of the two T's, and I think I have practical tips in there. I also have an article in Kansas English in 2009, Kansas English, called Research-Based Tutoring Tips for Working with Deaf Students. So I think, Therese, that is the article you're probably going to want to look at, because the whole article just consists of the tutoring tips and how they're based on the research, and that was, I'm not really sure the volume issue number, but it's Kansas English 2009, and the archives, well, you're in Kansas, so it's perfect. The archives may be live on their website of Kansas English, I'm not sure. And I don't know if that journal is indexed in any database. But yes, I think, coming to think of it, Teresa, I think that article is really what you're looking for. Clint, should I go ahead and answer the next question?
Sure, you could. I mean, it looks like KD Blue 91 has two questions there, so you can go ahead. Her second question is, do you learn the full extent of how to tutor with deaf students? And then the first question is, how effective are ASL courses in aiding with tutoring with deaf students?
I think my caution in the book, and I've not really actually seen this happen, but I could imagine that someone takes maybe a beginner course in ASL, and then all of a sudden, oh, go tutor that deaf person that came in because you had one semester of ASL. You know, I could just imagine that happening, and that could be a danger. I don't think anybody who's not fluent, anyone who's not fluent should attempt to tutor someone in, you know, in a language that they're not fluent in. Just imagine, like, if I try to tutor someone in German or something, it could be a disaster and really not fair to the person who you're tutoring. So for somebody, I think, who's just taken maybe one or two courses in ASL, they probably shouldn't tutor someone in sign language. But if someone's fluent in ASL, of course. Actually, the research by Cumming and So, 1996, it's a pretty famous study that they actually proved that it does not matter what language you use in the tutoring session as long as both people know that language. So if we both know Chinese and we can speak about our paper in Chinese, it's not going to affect the outcome of the tutoring session at all from the language that you use when you're tutoring. So yeah, both people know American Sign Language, go for it. If both people don't, maybe don't try. And do
Yeah,
I
and I
learn
think
the
that's
full
one of
extent
the.
of how to tutor?
Yeah, go ahead. You're
Go
fine.
ahead. No, you go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was thinking in terms of that may be another one of those sort of traditional writing center beliefs. I don't know if I don't really want to call it lore, but it's like one of those beliefs that you have to tutor in English that I think has been, pretty much debunked over the last,
Yeah.
few years. And I think, there's a lot of bilingual tutoring that I think occurs now that is much more, that can be effective. But yeah, Katie Blue 91 again. Her question or his question, sorry. Um, do you learn the full extent of how to tutor with deaf students? I'm not quite certain I understand that question, but if you understand it, Katie Blue
Well,
91. I don't know if you want to rephrase.
I'd have to say the answer to that is no, because this is just one study. It was a very limited, very limited. I only had 3 deaf participants and 3 hearing participants. So no, I don't know the full extent of how to tutor deaf students. It's just one study, can't be generalized. It's a qualitative study. My dissertation committee made me be very clear about that. What happened with these particular tutees in these particular situations, and no, it can't be generalized, and no, I don't know the full extent of how to tutor deaf students. So sorry, I know that's not very helpful, but that's the answer. And look, Teresa's put the link to that Kansas English article. If anyone is looking for just what to do, just the tutoring tips, and not all this other kind of research methods and stuff like that, if you're just interested in the practical, go to that link for that Kansas English article. I think that will be very useful. And I see Clint has put up the link to the linguistics and education article. That's probably more for graduate students, professionals who want to get more in depth into the research aspect of it. But the Kansas English article would be great for undergraduates or anyone. Practical tips.
Yeah, I kind of. Yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to get back to your research methodologies here. I remember, reading in the first, or I guess either the introduction or the first chapter, you're very careful to go over how you set this up. And one of the issues that came up for you is, and I think you stated this early at the beginning of our discussion, was that not being a deaf person yourself. That it created a certain barrier between you and the research that you're doing. How do you think, did it have a direct impact on, not understanding what was necessarily going on in a session, or did that allow you some more freedom because you weren't biased by any preconceived notions, say, had you been deaf and been doing this work?
Wow. I really don't know how to answer that. I I read a lot, obviously. It was for my dissertation, so I read everything I could possibly read. So I tried to familiarize myself with the culture just by reading, but everyone knows you can't learn everything just from books. Several of my participants said that over and over, you can't learn how to do this just by reading a book. You have to actually get in and do it. So there were cultural things that I was aware of and that I was looking for because of what I read in books. But there's also a kind of a barrier because historically, deaf people have been exploited by hearing people for research. So there's this kind of like this concept in anthropology where we're going to go to these other countries and study these exotic people and write articles and books about it, make our careers. So it's the same kind of thing where with white academics exploiting deaf people, going in and hearing people, kind of making their living off studying deaf people, writing books about them, getting their promotions, getting their research. So yeah, to a certain extent, that is true because I got my dissertation by studying deaf people, and without them, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I just tried to be very sensitive to not be exploiting them as I was trying to do my research. I had it in mind, so
Yeah,
I was
certainly.
trying to be aware.
Yeah, that reminds me. I mean, the book is published by Gallaudet University Press, and for those of you who don't know, Gallaudet is a school for the deaf. I'm curious about, did you particularly approach Gallaudet, or did they approach you, or I'm just really curious how you got that published, and then, it being from a deaf university, a university for the deaf, did that give it a little bit more authority in the sense that it's not just exploitative, because I think that's certainly a very important issue. We see that with like things in community writing centers and any work out in the community, is that oftentimes the universities are seen as exploitative, just like you said, trying to make their living off researching the poor and oppressed.
Yeah. Well, I tried definitely not to do that. I sent my book out to several publishers. I think Gallaudet was about the third publisher maybe that I had sent it to. I think I sent it to the Southern Illinois University Press of Studies in Writing and Rhetoric series, and it wasn't accepted for that. And I think I sent it to one other publisher. I'm trying to remember. But finally I thought, well, I really should send it to Gallaudet because it makes the most sense because Gallaudet publishes the most books about deaf studies, and I thought they would be interested because they couldn't say, oh, no one's interested in this topic because it went perfect with their press. And yes, they were interested. And a little side note is that my book is the first ebook that Gallaudet has published. If you try to look on Amazon, you won't see the ebook for sale on Amazon, but if you go to Gallaudet website, you can actually get this book as an ebook and read it on your Kindle or if you want. So yeah, for me, it was very nice to have this book published by Gallaudet because you're right, Clint. It kind of gives it almost a stamp of approval, and in the editing process, I was challenged on many of my statements by the editor because when this book was edited, it wasn't just copy edited for proofreading and stuff. But the person who edited it challenged me on my ideas and my statements, so I had to go back and say, wow, what am I saying here? How can I reword this so I don't things like overgeneralizing, making untrue statements, or saying all deaf people do this or that, or even making linguistic statements that weren't true. So I feel very comfortable that what's in the book is accurate because it was edited very well, and there were some points that the editor and I disagreed on. So I had to actually write lengthy footnotes to explain my position, so it wouldn't seem like, when my position was, let's say, controversial, I wrote several lengthy footnotes defending it.
Um, yeah, and again, encouraging folks in the text chat room there. If you have any questions, we're getting close. We've got about 5 minutes left. But I want to talk about disability in general again. As I recall, Rebecca, am I correct? You were on the original committee that came up with the position statement for IWCA on disability. Is that correct? Or am I
Yes.
just completely misremembering that?
No, you're right.
Excellent.
And I think the reason I was chosen was because everybody knew I was doing this for my dissertation research. So I'm sure that's why they chose me to be on the committee.
Yeah, and that position statement, ultimately I think impacts, any IWCA position statement, of course, is just it's basically it can't be a policy in that sense. It's ultimately encouraging writing centers to take on issues of disability. But what do you think in terms of what more can we be doing in writing centers to address disabled writers with disabilities and address their needs as well as approaching well, just that's the question I'll ask, is what can we be doing as writing centers to work with not just the deaf but other writers with disabilities?
I think, I don't know if it was the position statement that made an impact or just that things are moving along in the right direction, but I think things are just, I'm very, very happy with the way things are going now with disability and writing centers. It just kind of feels like everybody's aware of it now. Before, when you would read statements in people's books and articles, they would talk about race, class, gender, culture, and then they'd leave out disability. And they'd talk about every other kind of identity that you could have. But now people are always including disability as an identity when they're talking about different, different things that are going on in the writing center, different aspects. So I'm very pleased with the way things are going. I think they're going in the right direction. Any conference you go to, pick up any conference program, there's always sessions on disability now, when maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, there weren't. So I'm very, very pleased and very happy. I think people are even, there's a lot of conversation on W Center sometimes about writing center spaces. I think people are even being aware to make sure that the space is accessible for wheelchairs. Things like different kinds of software, different kinds of accessibility. There are always conversations now on W Center about that. So I think things are going in the right direction. I think people are aware. Perhaps still the disability that we are still seeing a problem with is probably mental illness. There's still a lot of stigma attached to mental illness. We're probably not there yet where people can just kind of be out with a mental illness and other people to sort of be comfortable around them. And that's a shame. I think that's probably the thing we have to work on. I'm putting together a book, Writing Centers and Disability, with Sharifa Daniels, and several of the writers in the book perhaps were bipolar or had depression or something like that and didn't want to come out, or even if they had ADHD or dyslexia, and which aren't mental illnesses, but that even anything like that, people don't want to come out with it. It's still sort of a stigma. So I think we need to try working to erase those stigmas that people are different. We all have different ways of being in the world, and there's not just one way to be in. If someone has a mental illness, so what? Come on in, and we'll try to make you comfortable. Oh, here, Therese has a comment here. I think I'm going to get that book, Therese. Thank you for suggesting it.
Hey, does anybody have any last-minute comments or questions? I want to thank everybody for coming. You can type it in the text box if you need to, and thank Rebecca for your wonderful work. And it truly is groundbreaking. There is a lot of work going on with disability studies now, but I think this is one of the first real books to come out with it. So thank you for sharing that work with us, as well as sharing in our discussion today. And this will be made available online somewhere. I don't know quite where yet. Alice M., who is on here, is one of the ones recording it, or at least coordinating that. I'm sure we'll put it out on W Center and post it on the PeerCentered blog when it comes out. But thank you all for coming, and next week we have our discussion. I believe it's at 1 o'clock, and it will be with Therese Thonis here, who's here joined us, and Rebecca again, and we're going to be talking about their research work. And if you're a friend of the page or like the page, the PeerCentered page on Facebook, all the events are published there. We also have the events published on PeerCentered.org. I'll type that in.
And while you're typing, Clint, let me thank you very much for inviting me. I really have enjoyed this, and I've enjoyed chatting with all of you, and those who I don't know, I hope I get to meet you in person very soon.
Thank you all once again, and we'll hopefully see you next week.